And so we're going to talk about rest today, because that's what we're looking at in the Sabbath talk today. Did you see this? This is actually part of a series that we've been doing about how he escaped organized or institutionalized religion to find Jesus. Is it possible to find Jesus in the modern church? It is. It really is. And we spent 8 or 9 weeks talking about that. One of them was about the Sabbath idea. And we found as we were doing this distinctively that Jesus did something very unusual in his ministry. And very seldom do we ever talk about the fact that Jesus went and deliberately stepped on the Sabbath over and over and over again. And he had a point to that. There was a reason why he was doing that. And so this is today is an outgrowth of trying to explore why he did that. Because he was making a very important point about the Sabbath that we tend to just gloss over. So that's what we're looking at, and we're closing that discussion today. But he did this on purpose to raise the issue, and we're trying to follow up. So did you see this cartoon last week? I put up. So we're not supposed to work on Sundays, but you do. Hey, what's up with that? Well, exactly. Pastors and people who run churches, they're very busy on Sunday. So are they breaking the Sabbath? All those who think they're breaking the Sabbath? All those who don't think they're breaking the Sabbath? All those who still need to think about this for a second because they know it's a trick question. That's exactly right. But so when you go in, even in the Old Testament, hey, you look in the Old Testament where the Sabbath was, you'd be stoned to death if you didn't do the Sabbath. You go to the Old Testament and there's the temple there in the Old Testament, there's sacrifices going on, and the Sabbath, the seventh day, was a busy place at the temple. It was a very busy place. And who ran that stuff? Well, the priests, the Aaronic priests. They were there just running all the stuff. So they're busy on the Sabbath, but they don't seem to be breaking it. So what's up with that? So when you look at the Sabbath, you can't just take this very simplistic approach that the Sabbath is don't do anything on the seventh day. Because clearly God's elect priests in the Old Testament were very busy, and they didn't violate the Sabbath. So we've been trying to paint a more complete picture of what the Sabbath is all about, and we're finishing it today. Last week we went big places with it, but this is what we found out. You go all the way back to Genesis 1 and 2, and you find that the seventh day is part of the creation process. God creates 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then on the seventh day, he relates. How does he do that? He relates to Adam and Eve in the garden. It's very clear in chapter 2. That's what the seventh day is. We also found out when we looked at that, the first 6 days, there's a morning and an evening and a next day. The seventh day, there's no end to. Big clues right here. And the rabbis will talk endlessly about what that means. But really what it means is that at the end of the creation process, God is saying after the 6 days, now you have my complete and undivided attention. I am going to relate to man. And that's what we see in the Garden of Eden. And that's what God's there, visiting with them, providing for them. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So in the same kind of way that God created for 6 days and then wanted to relate to his creation, he tells us, work for 6 days, and then on the seventh, relate to me. And this is the whole idea we had of this Eden life. That the point to all of this, the point to everything that God's done starting the beginning of creation was relating to man. That's the goal. That's the end. That's the seventh day. So last week we got our heads kind of exploded a bit, realizing that the Sabbath isn't just about what you do on Saturdays or the seventh day. It's really, according to the very beginning of the entire Bible, it really is God's intention of relating to us and us relating to him. That's why the Sabbath is such good news. That's why it makes me really mad when people degenerate it into a list of do's and don'ts, because the Sabbath is a wonderful gift from God to relate to him and to enjoy him. It comes out of the word seven. It's related to it, although it's unique all by itself. In fact, the word Shabbat doesn't show up until the middle of Exodus, so it's quite a while. In Genesis, it's just referred to as the seventh day, the seventh day, the seventh day, the seventh day. So that's what we're all about. So this is it, and I made this little shield last week because when we looked at the Garden of Eden, we found out that with God relating to man, now we're talking Genesis 2, you can check me on this, I'm not lying. Genesis 2, what God does is he provides for Adam and Eve by planting great trees in the garden, remember that, the fruit? And he also has his presence there. He walks in the stillness of the afternoon. Remember that? I mean, he's literally walking there. Hey, there's Adam, there's Eve, there's God. So he's relating to them. And also he gives them a purpose. He says, tend these trees over here. So he gives them a reason to fit into this creation. So as we look at this Eden life, which is really the Sabbath extended, this Eden life, he has these three principal things. When I think of the Sabbath, I always think of these three principal things on this little shield. The seventh day is all about God's presence and his provision for us and his purpose he's designed us to fit into it. It's a great deal. And Eden was a great place, but it sort of fell apart. And it wasn't God's fault. It was your fault. Well, it was Adam's fault. It was our fault in that we sinned right there and basically said, this is a great place. You're a great God. What wonderful trees. But you know what? I think I'd rather do this on my own terms. And God says, that's the end of that. But, and this is giving you a little preview, in the entirety of the Bible, going from Genesis to Revelation, in Genesis, in the Garden of Eden, there's a very peculiar tree there. You remember which one it is? Tree of life. It's gone and we're barred from it after the fall until Revelation. And in Revelation 22, it's back. The new creation. It's actually, if you want to look at it this way, Eden life, life with God, the way he intended it to be, starts out in Genesis in the garden and comes back in Revelation 22 when the new heavens and new earth. We get back to it. So we start in Eden and come back to Eden. And the only way we can come back to Eden is through Christ. So that's a lot of theology in just 2 minutes. So let's see if we can kind of add to this today. So the seventh day we summarize. For Israel, the seventh day Sabbath, that's, every 7 days, the Saturday, the seventh day Sabbath was a reminder of God's intention of Eden life for Israel. So it was like, God says, I want you to do this every 7 days, and I want it to be a reminder to you that my intention after all is said and done at the end, my intention is relationship with you. So take Saturdays off so you can remember that. Undivided attention. So that you can come back and remember that not only just at the end of this week, but at the end of all creation. Seventh day is still open. I want relationship with you. That's what I want you to remember. Life is not just about working. It's about relationship with God. So that's what the Sabbath was really supposed to communicate to him. And also, Israel's seventh day Sabbath was a testimony to the world of God's intention of Eden life for all mankind. So Israel was a model nation, a model in the sense that it was a smaller manifestation, but fully functional, of the society with God at its center. And with that model functional society, they would communicate experientially to the entire world what God's intention for all mankind is. Society with God at the center, with God's presence and his provision and his purpose for us fitting in. But Israel messed that up too. Darn. We don't have time to talk about that. So let's move on. Today, that's the review. Today, as we hover over space, we look at the Exodus from Egypt to Canaan, because as we go into the New Testament about the Sabbath, the New Testament refers back to the Old Testament, which makes sense, about the Sabbath. And one of the stories that he uses principally is the Exodus out of Egypt. So let's take a look. We'll review this really quick in case you don't remember this stuff. The Exodus from Egypt to Canaan. We're actually here. This is the Nile Delta right here. We're looking kind of to the northeast. And this is the Sinai Peninsula right smack dab in the middle. Here's the Nile River going down to the mountains in Africa. Sinai is there. This little swath of blue right through here, that's the Great Rift Valley. It's actually an earthquake valley, but up through here, this thing right here, that's the Dead Sea, and way up here, that's the Sea of Galilee, and this thing in between, that's Israel. So we have Egypt down here in the bottom of the screen, Israel on the top of the screen, and as we pick up the story, here's where 400 years of Israel has been living in the Nile Delta, and we pick up a story in Exodus 6:6. Say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from slavery to them. And I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment, and I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God. Who's all the I's in that? God. Not Israel, God. God's doing that. So God's saying, I'm going to take you out of this slavery in Egypt, and I'm going to make you a people for me. And he goes on and says more about that. He says, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who has brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. In fact, through the rest of the Old Testament, God refers to this over and over again. When he challenges them to take a new step in a very challenging direction, he stops as they stutter, and he says, I'm the God who got you out of Egypt. And you're supposed to say, oh, right, well, if you can do that, you can do this. So that's actually a catchphrase that comes over and over. I'm the God that got you out of Egypt, out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. Verse 8, and I'll bring you into the land that I swore to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you for a possession. I am the Lord. I am Yahweh. Who's the I again? God is. Who gets them out of Egypt? God. Who brings them to the new land? God. I. God says over and over and over and over. Okay? So this is his plan, and he wants to tell this to the nation of Israel, and this is what Moses tells them. God's going to do this. He's not only going to take them out, but he's going to get them in to the new land as well. So they come out of the Nile Delta. My arrow is somewhat schematic because we don't know exactly what route they took, but they got to the bottom of present-day Israel, which is desert. Okay? They got to the bottom of present-day Israel and had some great adventures in between. So I jumped to Exodus 16, Verse 4, then the Lord said to Moses, behold, I'm about to rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather day's portion every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not. And this bread was called, you know what manna means? It's one of the biggest jokes in the entire Bible. It means, what? It does. It literally is what it means. Here, through Moses, he tells the Israelites, I'm going to rain bread. Now, if God told me I'm going to rain bread from heaven, I'd expect to see bagels, hanging on bushes or something like that, something that looks like bread. So when they go outside and they don't see bagels hanging on bushes, and they see this, they go, what? Should we go out today and get some more what and eat it today? Because there's what hanging on the trees out there. So let's go have some what. Hey, do you boil your what, or do you bake your what? Or do you eat your what raw? This just means what? 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 So he's going to rain that. But see, there's this clause at the end here. I'm going to test them. How did he test them? We don't have time to cover this completely. But remember, he said on days 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, go outside, gather in the morning. You'll have enough to eat the entire day. Don't try and keep it over to the next day because it'll get worms in it and it'll rot. That's not the point. The point is for you to do it every day. Except on day 6, something great happens. You can pick twice as much, and it won't rot if you keep half of it overnight, and you can eat that tomorrow on the Sabbath, and that's God's provision for you. And then you go back to Monday and do it all over again. So he's saying, I'm gonna test them. How did he test them? Well, a couple ways actually, because when the manna would come out, they're thinking, hey, this is great. I'm gonna fill my tent with this. What? And I'm going to keep it in there, and I'm going to have so much tomorrow. And that didn't work because it would actually rot the next day. So that's a test. They realized, I guess I better believe what God says about this. I'll just take what I need for today. And God was very generous about what they could take. But you got to eat it all. And then the other test was, should we take twice as much? If I take twice as much on the 6th day, hey, let's just have a feast and eat it all tonight. And then tomorrow on the 7th day, we'll pick some more. That's not going to work because you're not going to find any what on the bushes on the 7th day. So there was a test, and it was a training test. It was a train. Remember we talked about the Sabbath as being the 7th day? He's creating a nation for himself, and he's building into the nation's mindset Sabbath. I want you to stop working on the Sabbath. I want you to relate to me on the Sabbath. And even while they're in transition from Egypt to Israel, he's training them about this. Listen, I'm going to give you what on the bushes. On the 7th day, don't go out and collect it. You can take twice as much on the 6th day. And every single day, I promise, God says, that's my word, there will be new what on the bushes every day. Okay? And you don't have to store it up. It'll be just fine. So just trust me. Trust my word. So it really was, later on Moses will tell us, he'll say, that whole manna thing, God did that manna thing so that you'd understand, these words, these are really famous, that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from God. You can trust his word to provide for you. So anyway, don't have time to go into that too. Let's just keep going on the story. So they're down there, and they've moved over here to the southern part of Canaan, the promised land, and then we jump to Numbers 13, and another event happens. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I'm giving to the people of Israel. So they're right on the doorstep of getting into this promised land, the land that God said to Abraham and his son Isaac and his son Jacob, and who passed it on to the 12 tribes of Israel. I'm giving you this land, and here finally, we're there. So before we walk in, let's send in some spies. So there's 12 tribes of Israel. God says, pick one guy from every tribe, someone who will be respected when he brings back a report. So they pick 12 guys. There they are, the 12 guys lining up right there. They go into the promised land as promised, and they go in as spies, and they're gone for 40 days. And everyone wonders. 40 days. And then finally they come back, and as they come back, they give their report. Unfortunately, 10 said, I don't know. And 2 said, we can do this. We can do this. You remember who the 2 were, by the way? We'll just do a little Bible trivia right now. Caleb and Joshua. Caleb and Joshua. So they come back and they say, well, here's part of the report. Numbers 13:31. Then the men who had gone up with Caleb, said, hey, we're not able to go up against the people, for they're stronger than we are. Now, they weren't lying. They were telling the truth. When they went into the land, they looked, and there were giants there. There were guys that they knew that if they went into hand-to-hand combat with these guys, they would lose. So they said, well, it may be a great place. Look, we're carrying these incredible grapes we brought back to show you how fruitful it is. But what's the point if we're all going to be dead? So the 10 said, we're going to die there because the people are too big for us. And Joshua and Caleb said, yeah, but God promised. Remember, so now we're at this tension between what God promised and what you're able to do. And here's the tension. Here's the tension. Great story. We move on. Here's this barking that goes on amongst the people. So Numbers 14:2. They say, when they hear this bad report, oh, would that we had died in the land of Egypt. Sorry, is that too harsh for you? Okay. Does that sound like Julia Child? Are you kidding me? Really? Okay. Or would that we had died in this wilderness, because they're being very dramatic. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become a prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt? Why did he bring us here? What's he doing? We're just going to die here. This is some kind of big cosmic joke from God. Let's go back to Egypt, which is a life of enslavement. And they're thinking that's better than dying in the desert. Well, that's rational. It is better than dying in the desert. The one thing that changes everything is God's promise. So really it comes down to, are you willing to trust God's promise? After all, this is a promise that didn't just start with us. It started many centuries before with our father Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. It's coming to us now. This is a long-term project. And now we're right on the doorstep. Are we willing to take God at his word, fully aware that if God's not with us, we will die? Sabbath people rest from their work, making room for God to work on their behalf. Did the Israelites realize that God was going to work on their behalf when they went into the promised land? No, they're basically saying if we trust our own works, in terms of being soldiers there, we'll fail. But people who are Sabbath-minded, and that's what we're coming to today, people who are Sabbath-minded, although they're well-informed about their own limitations, will say the 2 best words in the Bible, but God. And that's different. That changes everything. Is God's word trustable? Am I willing to actually place my hands in his ability to work on my behalf? Does this really work? Because if it doesn't work with Israel, I'll die. Tomorrow there will be no life if I don't put my trust in God today. Ooh, I'm giving you a lot of conclusions already. So this is just a workup. This is a workup. And we talked last week about the fact that the Sabbath is very much an issue about trust, especially when we talked about the 7-year Sabbath. God says every 7 years, don't plant. Well, excuse me, if we don't plant, then next year we don't eat. Yeah, if it's all on you, but God says, I'll give you food. Well, but if you're wrong, God, we're all going to starve. Yeah, so again, it comes back to the trust thing. Are you willing to trust God's promise? When he's explicit about his promise, and you know your shortcomings, and you see the contrast between your shortcomings and the ability of God, and he promises, are you willing to step out in faith and live on his promise? That's a Sabbath thinker, trusting God in every context. Okay, are we yet to today's passage? Well, not quite, but we're really close. So did they have trust? Not really. So they stayed in the desert for an entire generation, for 40 years. Joshua and Caleb got it, and maybe some people with them, but a whole generation died waiting for a new generation to come up. So here we go. So we're almost to today. Last week we talked about the old covenant of the Sabbath, and this week the new covenant. But the new covenant is going to use this whole process in the desert. Did my mic die? Okay, I'm still there. Okay, so we're back in the desert, okay, and we pick up today in Hebrews 3, New Testament. Yay, finally. But he's going to talk about the Old Testament. That's okay, because you've got the story down pat. Hebrews 3, verse 16. So, for who were those who heard and yet rebelled? Was it not all those who left Egypt led by Moses? Now, the phrasing is very interesting here, because God got them out of Egypt, part A. Part B was get them into the promised land. So, we look at this and say, how is it that they could actually see in the near proximity of time God's power getting them out of Egypt, and then stand at the edge of the giants in the promised land and say, he can't do that? See what I'm saying? And that's how he's phrased it right here. The same God who got him out is going to get him in. But somewhere in between, they rebelled. They were not willing to trust in God's leadership and his power on their behalf. Was it not all those who left Egypt led by Moses? Verse 17. And with whom was he provoked for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? So this rebellion of not being willing to trust God, this non-Sabbath thinking on their part, irritated God. Would it irritate you if you said to a friend, I promise, next weekend, I'm going to come to your house with my truck and I'm going to help you move your house? And then you wait for the next weekend, and you get there, and the person doesn't show up. And you're thinking, but they promised. They promised. They weren't good to their word. That would irritate you. Well, from God's perspective, take that issue and multiply it 1,000,000 times. Because here God makes a promise to them and says, I will do this, and as a down payment on your faith, I got you out of Egypt. So you can take that to the bank, so when you get to the brink of the promised land, you can remember, hey, well, that's the God who got us out of Egypt. So giants are nothing. I got you there. I made a promise. I told through Moses, I'll get you out. I'll get you in. And then people said, well, I don't think so. That's why God's irritated. I would be irritated. Those whose bodies fell in the wilderness. That's that whole generation. And then the writer of Hebrews goes on, verse 18 of chapter 3. And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest? But to those who were disobedient. So where is his rest? It's this promised land. So now the whole idea of the Sabbath is an idea of rest anyway. It's resting from our labors, relying on God's labors on our behalf. And now the writers of Hebrews is reinforcing a theme we get in the Old Testament. Coming into this promised land is actually the fulfillment of God's promise of rest for them. It's the promise of Sabbath life for them, which means Sabbath life is the presence of God with his full provision and his purpose given to me to fit into that. That was what the whole idea of coming into the promised land was. That's why the writer of Hebrews says that place is his rest for you. Rest from what? Well, in a way, rest from labors, rest from foreigners who are going to come in and take over and hurt us, rest from pests, rest from drought, rest from all these things. That's all included in the idea of God's provision for Israel. So when he points to this promised land that they did not want to walk into and trust God, what they're saying is, I don't think, God, you're going to be there. I don't think you're going to provide for us. And I think we have no purpose in going there to start with. Oh, you never want to say that to God. But their hesitance in the desert is exactly. They did not enter his rest. This was a gift that he had planned for them and had promised for more than 500 years. But they were disobedient. Hebrews 3:19. So we see that they were unable to enter because of Unbelief. What did they not believe? God's promise. Will God do what he says he's going to do? Again, it's the principal issue on Sabbath living. Will God do what he promises to do, even when my sensory faculties tell me that if God doesn't come here, we're all going to die, right? Am I willing to trust him? Am I willing to actually take a step of trust based on nothing but his word? Is God faithful? Does God love me enough to carry out his word on my behalf? Am I willing to walk out of the desert into a place that he characterizes as his rest? Well, it all sounds good until you look at all the problems to get there, which you realize you can't handle. There's a lot about Sabbath it's about not only stopping working, but stopping being in the center of control of everything, trying to force life to come to you. Let that sink in for a second. It's all about taking yourself out of that control position. Because God says, I will provide for you if you let me. A Sabbath person is someone who deliberately stops trying to control that outcome for life in order to allow God to do that. Will God do that? He promised. He promised he will. Yeah, Larry. Psalm 23 is a Sabbath rest psalm. In fact, anytime that you come across rest as a theme in the Old Testament or New, you're talking about Sabbath. And that rest results because we can let go of all that stuff and let God rush in and take care of us. Ooh, yeah, that's exactly right. You're getting it. So that unbelief is the unbelief about what God's going to do. Is he going to be present with us? Is he going to provide for us? Do we have a purpose there? And that purpose, by the way, was to be God's people and to be a testimony to the world of his intention for mankind. Exodus 17, I'll jump back to this. Exodus 17:7. And he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah because in the quarreling of the people of Israel and because they tested the Lord by saying, is the Lord among us or not? That's actually the core of their disbelief. Here they've left Egypt. Some mighty God has taken them out with miraculous deliverance. I mean, come on, you saw the movie with Charlton Heston, right? I mean, the sea parted, and they saw all that stuff. They understood something about the power of God, but they get to the edge here, and they're not just doubting God's power. They're doubting that God's with them at all. Doubting that God's with them at all. Now, I got to tell you, if we stand back and do a quick application, when you're on the verge of stepping into a dangerous place where there's giants, speaking metaphorically, the big question isn't, can God take this? The big question is God with me? And that's what they doubted. Sure, God got us out of Egypt. But hey, now we're facing giants. Maybe he's not here anymore. Maybe this is some kind of cosmic joke. Maybe God, it's not that God's unable, but maybe God said, I'll get you out, but you got to get yourself in. You know, maybe God's not going to pull all the way through with us. Maybe he's not here. That's the fundamental part of disbelief. God is not here. And yet for Sabbath thinkers, it's the top. God's presence is here. He's present. You going to say, Tito?
But they're still getting what, so he must be there.
So yeah, they're still getting what, so he must be here. Yeah, and in fact, there's no reason why they have any rational reason to doubt God's presence. When God says, I'm going to put what on the bushes every morning, and he does, how can you say God's not with us? Because you know that the minute that the what stops coming, God must have left us. I mean, they had that right all the way through. God gave them enough evidence to be able to trust his promises. And that's another thing I wanted to make sure you caught really quickly here. Faith, the ability to trust and depend on God, faith is built in understanding who God is, and God wants to have you understand who he is so that you say, it's rational for me to trust him. Really. It's not an unfounded hope. It's actually a founded hope. And with Israel, it was founded on the fact of the Exodus, of the daily what on the bushes, and on and on and on and on. It was founded on the fact that as they wandered in the desert, there was this gigantic pillar of cloud during the day, the presence of God, that many scholars believe spread out like an umbrella to give them shade in the desert, which is a very good thing. And at night, a night light to scare away the animals and the raiders. I mean, the whole thing pictures protection. So how can you get to the edge of the promised land and say, I don't think God's with us anymore? How can you say that when you're in the edge of the promised land? See, this whole story isn't here for us to point fingers at the Israelites. They're there so we can point at us, because that's what we do. We have enough faculty, like I said, to be able to look forward in time and to define the possibilities of the threats that come to us if we step forward. We're good at that. In fact, that keeps us awake at night. Oh, yeah, this could happen, and then this could lead to this, and this. Oh, it's going to be horrible. And you know, when you go to bed, when you're on the verge of these kind of scary places, all your mind does is create scenarios of possibilities of doom. Is it just me that does that? I'm getting vacant stares. So you have enough faculty given to you by God to be able to look into the future and recognize threat. And I think he does it on purpose. That's why he sent spies in the land, so you can recognize threat, so that when the loving kindness of God intercedes on your behalf, you can say, I couldn't ever do that, but I got through that. How? God. Because I can't. Oh, just way too much application here. I quoted this guy last week, Watchman Nee, and this is a perfect place in this Exodus story to quote him again. Really, really well-written leader of the Chinese church back at the beginning of the 20th century. Anyway, he said this: man's failure is not due to his weakness. Remember, they said the giants were too powerful? Man's failure isn't due to his weakness, but to his not accepting God's strength. And that's why they fell in the wilderness. Because they understood their weakness, but would not take the next step and accept God's strength. Based on his promise. A Sabbath person can rest and let go of the situation, knowing that God's loving kindness for me never fails. It's new every morning. Great is his faithfulness to us. That's a Sabbath person who knows how to be able to rest because God's loving kindness is sovereign for you. That's a Sabbath mindset. Okay, let's push on. Sabbath people rest from their work, making room for God to work on their behalf. You just got to keep thinking that way, because that's what goes on. So when do we do this? Is it just weekly on the end of the weeks? Is it on the holidays, which Israel had? You know, they had holidays that were special Sabbath holidays. Is it just on holidays? Is it on the 7-year Sabbath when they had to stop planting altogether and trust that God would feed them for an entire 1, 2, and actually 3 years because of the whole cycle of planting and harvesting? No. When do you do this? 24/7, 365. Really, the Sabbath idea isn't just isolated to a Saturday or to a 7th year. God's people are people who constantly trust him every day, in every moment, when he proclaims his faithfulness and his loving kindness to us. And when you're on the edge of a land with giants, you can say, if it weren't for God, I wouldn't survive this. But he can, because he loves me. Now, we are also assured by the fact that we know that he's present. And that's what's really different from the old covenant to the new covenant. In the old covenant with Israel, God presented himself and his presence in the middle of their camp with this Shekinah glory cloud glowing thing at night. But with us in the New Testament, after the resurrection of Christ and after Pentecost, we all have the Holy Spirit. His presence with us is assured and widespread and poured out all over the place. So this is why we can do this. For the Sabbath in the New Testament and after the giving of the Holy Spirit is really a 24/7, 365 thing. It's not just a once a week thing. It's all the time. It's actually a mindset of how you approach life all the time. And it comes down to the fact that at any moment in any day, not just on the 7th day, I can put down stuff and I can relate to God. I can have a 7th day anytime, anywhere, all the time. Well then, is the Sabbath on Saturday or Sunday? We'll talk about that. Hebrews 4, and this is where he makes his point. Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest, that's Canaan, the promised land, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. For good news came to us just as to them, but the message they heard did not benefit them because they were not united by faith with those who listened. Do you hear that now? Do you hear it? God has made a promise to us of living in his rest. with him living in our midst 24/7. He's made that promise. But let's not let it go over our heads. The promise is there. See, he says, the promise of entering his rest remained. When they came to the edge of the promised land, the promise was still there. By the way, the promised land is called the promised land because it's the promise. It's that promise. Oh, that promised land. Yeah. Well, the promise remained when they stood on the edge. God didn't revoke the promise. The promise was still there. But you can fail to participate in his promised rest if you disbelieve his intentions and his power to do it on your behalf. If you disbelieve God's word, his promise still remains. And now when we back and we looked at this last week, the Sabbath is really, it's a catchphrase in many respects for abundant life that Jesus promised about, the saved life, heaven, all this age and the age to come. It's all about that. It's this new life that God promises to us. And this promise remains for all mankind and stays there. The promise is there unilaterally. We don't participate in it because we don't believe the God who made the promise. And that's why our message to people isn't so much about the promise of life, it's about the one who made the promise. The one who made the promise. We talk about Jesus, perfect reflection of who God is, and God himself. We talk about that because the one who made this promise for real life can come through with his promise. So we talk about the one who made the promise. That's why we do that. Good news came to us, just as to them, but the message they heard did not benefit them because they were not united by faith with those who listened. Verse 7, I'm going to skip to verse 7 in Hebrews 4. Read all of Hebrews 4 if you get a chance. We only have time to look at a few things. Verse 7, again, he appoints a certain day, today, saying through David so long afterward, in the words already quoted, today, if you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts. That's a quote from Psalm 95. So the writer of Hebrews is using a great argument. He says, okay, as the Israelites stood on the edge of the promised land, and they wouldn't go in because they disbelieved God, then many years later, David writes, relating to that and to his time and forward, the promise goes to today, not just standing on the edge of the promised land, but today. And so he's saying to us through those words, God has provided a promise of his rest to us today. Today. And so he encourages us. So while it's called today, which is like right now, while it's called today, listen to his voice. What's his voice saying? The promise of life in his rest. That's what he's promising. Listen to it. Listen to what he's saying, and don't let it be contaminated by your heart becoming hard. What is a hardened heart? A hardened heart says, I don't think God's going to pull through with his promise. Don't think he really loves me. Don't think he really has my best intentions in mind. After all, I think I'm the best master of my best intentions for everything that's best for me. Me, my. I can do this, me, my, in control best. A hardened heart doesn't allow God to come in and provide. It won't stop working to provide life for itself. It won't lay that down. But a Sabbath heart hears the promises of God and says, okay, your will, not mine, be done. Because I have a sneaking suspicion, God, that you love me more than I love myself. So I'll place myself and trust my future into your hands because of your love. That's a Sabbath thinking. Can you see how that's kind of letting go and resting? And constantly trying to wrestle with life to give you life? That's a restful mindset, is what that is. He goes on. If Joshua had given them rest, see, Joshua's the one who eventually led them in the promised land. If Joshua had given them rest, well, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So then, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. And you know what that Sabbath rest is? Our life in Christ after being saved by him. That's the Sabbath rest. Again, from an Eden perspective, it's about allowing God's presence to be in our life, allowing him to provide in his loving kindness for us, accepting his purpose for what's going on, which, by the way, presumes that you have to let go of the purpose that you thought you had. That's hard too. But that's what it's all about. So when you see the Sabbath, we're really talking about, from a New Testament perspective, the place you live after you give your life to Christ. 24/7, 365. It's a return to an Eden-like existence. Now right there you're thinking, well, I don't really live an Eden-like existence right now. Let me make a list for you about the problems I got. Well, remember a couple weeks ago we talked about that in this time right now, we're in this phase between this age and the age to come. Remember I talked about, and they sort of overlap right now? The age to come is the fulfilled Sabbath life. That's what that is. Depending on him 100% for everything. But in this time right now, we're in this funny kind of in-between stage where we have one foot in this age full of its fallenness and sin and depravity and death because of the choices we make. And we have this other foot in the age to come, which is Sabbath living right now with the presence of God. Now, life because of his presence, his provision, and his purpose. We're in this weird hybrid state. Well, why would he leave us in this hybrid state? I want to get my foot out of this age and get my both feet in the age to come. Well, like Israel, you and I are meant to be signposts to the ultimate plan of God on the seventh day, which is restored relationship with him. And so he leaves us here to demonstrate that. That's why he brought Israel to the brink of the promised land, and where he finally brought them in so people could look afterwards in the rest of the world and say, these people in Israel, they're crazy. Their God let them die in the wilderness because they wouldn't believe him, wouldn't take him at his word. But when they finally got in, let me tell you what happened there. This is crazy. They've got a God who actually provides for them. God, let me just give you one example. When God took them into the promised land, he brought them out of Egypt. And by the way, the major irrigation source for crops in Egypt is the Nile River. And so they irrigated out of the Nile River. They expected the Nile to overflow every year, and that would not only bring water, but it would bring great soil to the crops. I mean, it's a great place to live. And then God takes them out of there, where they know the agriculture of the Nile, and he takes them into Canaan, and he says, I am going to deliberately put you on the top of the mountains in Israel, where there are no Niles. Well, then how do our crops get water? And God says, I'm going to bring rain and the dew on your crops. And that's the daily expectation of God's blessing on your crops. You will starve if I don't provide rain. So I'm going to make you dependent on me to bless you with rain. And I'll do it for you. I'll do it for you. So they actually went up on the top of the mountains where you can't really grow things without, irrigation, and God would bring rain. And they would live. Again, it's almost a throwback to the manna era. That's what God was doing with them. And the sweetest, sweetest rain that comes from God on the tenderest of the smallest plants that sprout out of the ground. You can have rain that kind of kills your early plants. We had hail this year that took out a lot of ours. That's brutal precipitation. But when the small plants come out, the best rain is dew. It's gentle. It comes and you can't see it. Overnight, you wake up in the morning and those little drops are on those little plants, and they go, oh, you love this. So in the Old Testament, dew was a metaphorical device to talk about God's unseen but persistent blessing of gentleness and what we need for life. I'm way off topic. Okay, so he says, we're not just talking about coming into the promised land as the Sabbath rest, but there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. That's you. There remains a Sabbath rest. There does. There remains a Sabbath rest, a place where God's presence is manifest, a place where God provides wholly, and a place where God says, I have a purpose for you being here. This is great good news. For whoever has entered God's rest, listen to this, whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. Do you hear that? If you all come from any religious background that relies on works to provide for you, then you're not trusting God to provide for you. You're trusting you to provide for you. You have to rest from your works. In the largest sense, life with God is life that comes from God, not life that we create. And that's what he's trying to tell Israel, and that's what he's trying to tell us. And if we'll just let go of controlling the access to life and let him flood in and bring life, he's delighted to do it on your behalf. That's what he's saying right there. But hey, you got to stop trying to do it yourself. You got to let him do it. Got to let him do it. A Sabbath mindset person is a person who constantly is increasingly dependent on the presence of God and taking him at his word for his provision for you. That's why I love Christians who've walked with the Lord for a while, and they're starting to get this. They get this. And you come to a situation that's a catastrophe that's coming in. I mean, the whole world's falling apart and everything's horrible, and it's just horrible. And the people who understand Sabbath thinking say, well, see what God does. He's been good in the past. He'll be good in the future. There's an iconic story about Corrie ten Boom, who was she was in World War II. She was in concentration camps because her Christian family housed Jews. But Corrie ten Boom says some really great stuff about this expectation. There's at the end of the Vietnam War, when she was traveling the world, speaking and stuff like that, she would go to hotspots. She flew to Vietnam. This lady who I don't know, was in her 70s or 80s by this time. She flew to Vietnam with a bunch of other Christians. Vietnam was imploding because we were in the process of pulling out all of our troops. The Viet Cong from the north were coming in and taking over huge areas of Saigon. I mean, it was a time that if you had any affinity to the United States, you needed to get out of town. And she was flying into town. And when she got there, she tells the story that they went in this room and some people told about the military mess that was going on and the danger to themselves because everything was falling apart. And in Jim's quote, I wish I got to get this exact someday, but she basically, I heard it said that she kind of clapped her hands together, rolled them together, and she said, it's going to be exciting to see what God does now. Well, why don't you get in a plane and go home? Are you crazy, lady? But she understood from a Sabbath perspective that because the world is imploding does not mean that God has pulled his presence out. And since he hasn't pulled his presence out, nor is he slow in his love toward us, he'll provide. That's a Sabbath person. You can engage that 24/7, 365. A presence of God, a dependence on his provision, and an understanding that he has a purpose for me being right here, right now. Oh man, could we go for hours on this? We don't have hours. So really the Sabbath is a catchphrase in the Old Testament for these things. It was Eden life. It was the target. It was the goal of the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, living in a place where God would provide, where God would be the center. It was the promise. It really was the promise that was made through the entire Old Testament. In the New Testament, we see in Hebrews 10, he tells us the law was just a shadow of the good things to come instead of the true form of those realities. So the Sabbath, as they did in the Old Testament, was important. The seventh day thing, the 7-year thing, the 49-year thing, they were important as pointers to the fact that God has rest in store for us with him at the center of life. Yes. So they're important for that. And it's a catchphrase in the New Testament for all of these things, for eternal life and for heaven and for the age to come. That's the Sabbath. And that's why God was so insistent that we don't forget the Sabbath in the Old Testament or the New. And it has nothing to do with what day of the week it is. It's a 24/7, 365 mindset of dependence on the provision of God because of his presence. That's Sabbath people. Those are the people that God wants. So we need to wrap it up. Jesus said very practically, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you... that is such good news. That is such good news. And you have to understand, this point about the Sabbath connection to rest was not lost on the Pharisees who heard him say this. Come to me, and I will give you rest. God said to Israel, come to me, and I will give you rest. Jesus says, come to me, and I will give you rest. Jesus is putting himself in the shoes of God. And if he's not God, that's blasphemy. But hey, he is, so it's not blasphemy. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Learn from me, for I'm gentle, lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your hands. No, rest for your souls. This part of you that wrestles with controlling the circumstances of life in order to squeeze real life out of this cesspool, awful place that we're in. That thing that worries about what will happen to me tomorrow. This soul that just wonders if life is for me. Jesus says, come to me and I'll bring rest to this place that worries about if I have a future of life. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. I mean, this really reminds me when we talk about the Sabbath, we get so distracted by coming back to, okay, Jim, I get all this metaphorical stuff about the Sabbath, but is it Saturday or Sunday? Can we get back to something practical? I mean, how are we supposed to do this? And it reminds me of Thomas coming to Jesus when Jesus tells him, I'm going someplace where you can't go, but hey, you know the way. Remember this? And then he comes to Jesus and says, I don't think I know the way. Right? Remember that? And what does Jesus say? I am the way. It's the same kind of thing. If you want to know how to pursue rest in God and Sabbath, pursue Jesus. The one whose presence is near through his Spirit, who wants to provide for you and who has a unique purpose for you. A unique purpose for you. So this is where I'm going to rest. We're going to finish this now. Sabbath people rest. Jim's famous acrostics. You ready for an acrostic that will change your life? I didn't think so. So Sabbath people rest from earning life, trying to squeeze life out of life. They rest from earning life by expecting God's provision, dun, 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 by sensing God's presence, dun, 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 and by trusting God's purpose. 24/7 through 65. The God who is near wants to show you his love by providing for you and being near to you. You don't have to spend your Christian life worrying about what tomorrow will be all about and trying to figure out how to wrangle the circumstances of where you are so that you'll have life from it tomorrow. Don't have to worry about that anymore. There remains for God's people a Sabbath rest. And that Sabbath rest not only starts today, but comes to its completion at the end of this age and the beginning of the age to come, where finally sin and death and all that sorrow is gone, and the fulfillment of the fullness of that Sabbath rest that we start to actually get to be part of right now will come to fulfillment. That's great good news. Rest from earning life by expecting God's provision, by sensing God's presence, by trusting God's purpose. And by the way, I use these all the time when I'm on the brink of a giant's situation. No kidding. When things seem to be exploding or imploding or everything just going south, and you realize that the next steps I can take in dependence on God, or I can take in worry and anxiety, wondering how I'm going to handle it. It's just two fundamental paths. And I ask myself, is God going to provide for me? Well, he said he would. Okay, I'll take him at his word. He's going to provide for me. But is God really here? Does he see what's going on? Or am I like one of the psalmists who writes many times at the beginning of the psalm, God, are you asleep? Don't you see what's going on? But to be fair, at the end of the psalm, he says, you're here. You'll take care of me. But the temptation in the moment when you see giants is to say, God doesn't see the giants, but I do. And God sees the giants. He sees the giants. But is he here? He's here. Will he provide? He'll provide. And then the big question when I'm on the edge of giant land, I ask myself, what am I doing here? Do you ever ask that? What am I doing here? I'd rather be over there. But God has brought me to this because he has a purpose. Now that purpose may be partially to change you. It might be partially to change the people, the circumstance you're going into. But he does have a purpose. This is not haphazard and accidental. So when you're in the brink of giant land, just don't forget this. Remember those three things. Is God here? Yes. He sees what's going on. Does he love me? Is he going to provide for me and take care of me? He will. Does he have a purpose for me being here, or does this seem like some kind of accidental, craziness? No, he's got a purpose. Step into the land of giants. That's a Sabbath thinker right there. Now, this is for now in this hybrid time of this age and the age to come, but it's also forever. That's the fullness. That's the return to Eden at the end. That's why the tree of life is in Revelation 22 as well as in Genesis 1 and 2. But let me paint for you a contrast. If you've never done this, when I study the Bible, many times I think, what would be the opposite of what I just read? Have you ever done that? It's a great exercise to do. When you read something, think, what would the opposite of this be? Here's the opposite of that wonderful acrostic that's just changed your lives. But here's the opposite, okay? Stressed people instead of Sabbath people, I anticipate my doom. This is what I anticipate my doom by dwelling on my inadequacy, by hearing my own voice only, and by being despondent with my purpose. Yeah. And that's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in a spiritual sense. Because the giants will really mess up your attention. You have an attention deficit in terms of relating to God in the moment. That's what it does. And also, it makes you really hyperactive. We're all going to die. We're all going to die. Right? That kind of stuff. I mean, it's a perfect fit. You have a choice of one of two ways to live life. You can live life as a Sabbath person, relying on the presence of God, whose loving kindness brings provision, and he assigns purpose for you to being where you are. Or you can be this. Paul says it really simply in one of his letters. You got one of two choices. You can pray or you can worry. And everyone knows how productive worrying is. All it does is it wastes your sleep, and it's really a testimony of the fact that you can't handle the giants. But when you pray, you can take that to God, and you can remind yourself of this Sabbath God who promises Sabbath rest for his people, and remind yourself, God is here, God's going to provide in his loving kindness, and he's got a purpose for me being here. This kind of life is a train wreck. It's a train wreck. So we come back to this. I rest from earning life. That's trying to wrestle life out of my experience. I rest from earning life by expecting God's provision, by sensing God's presence, by trusting God's purpose. And when I got involved doing acrostics, I came up with so many other letters for these and similar words. I'll just share a couple of them. Maybe you can do some yourself. But in this first one, or the second one, not just expecting God's provision, but enjoying it. Enjoying it. So as you walk into the land of giants, you walk into it, and as you make your first step, say, well, God, I'm expecting you're going to pull through for me. Here we go. And then when he does, you enjoy it. That's a gigantic testimony to the world that lives the previous slide. Gigantic testimony. Remember when Daniel went into Babylon with his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? And remember when the king Nebuchadnezzar threw them into the fire and said, we're going to throw you in the fire unless you change your mind and denounce your God of the past and recognize him. I remember all that stuff? And then as they stood on the brink of what clearly was a fire that they could not handle in their own power, they stood there and they said, well, we're not going to change our minds. But even if God doesn't save us from this, he's still God. That's a great expectation. Even if he doesn't save us from this, he's not, it could be presumption on my part that he's going to, but if he doesn't, he's still God. He really is. And then when they got inside the fire there, they enjoyed his provision because they got a visit from probably Jesus himself. Great stuff. This last one is trusting God's purpose. I also had tending God's purpose. Remember when Eden, when Adam and Eve were put there, God gives them a job to tend the garden. Tend God's purpose for that place. So when you find yourself stepping into the land of giants, it's not so much just trusting that I'm here because God has a purpose, but once you get to it, instead of being consumed again with the threat that surrounds you, say, God, I'm not here for me, I'm here for you. What is it you want me to do? What is it? I want to tend to your purpose for why you've brought me to such a calamitous place. What is it you want right here? I'm going to tend to your purpose and not my own. Which, by the way, is the easiest way to diffuse threat in your mind when you're in the land of giants. You understand God has you there for a purpose, and tomorrow morning you say, well, God, I'm here for your purpose. What is it? I'm ready. I want to tend to that and not to me. And I want to be here for as long as you need me to be here. Rather than saying, God, can we kind of close this out because this is really uncomfortable being here? No, you say, God, I want to be here for whatever purpose you've got and for as long as it takes. I want to tend to your purpose. It takes you so much out of yourself and this self-absorption we have with our well-being. It's a marvelous thing. So anyway, feel free to do whatever you want on those things. Excuse me, which day is the Sabbath? Today is. And tomorrow is. And the day after that is. And the day after that is. The day after that is. So when anyone ever asks you, where exactly do you fall in the debate about Saturday and Sunday? Say, oh, I think Saturday's the Sabbath. And I think Sunday's the Sabbath. And I think Monday's the Sabbath. And I think any day that I can enjoy the presence of God and rely on his provision for me and understand his purpose for putting me there, that for me is a Sabbath. Because I can rest. It's such good news. It's why Jesus made such a point of violating the man-made definition of the Sabbath when he came. He wanted people to understand that the Sabbath was a wonderful gift from God to his creation of man for rest and for life and relationship with God. Oh, what a tragedy it had turned into by the first century. And what a tragedy it continues to be in modern Christendom and beyond, when all we do is talk about which day is it and what can't I do. I'd rather talk about what God can do. The Sabbath, this is by a guy named Robert Spear. The Sabbath is the shadow of Christ on the hot highway of time. The Sabbath is the shadow of Christ in the hot highway of time. So like the Israelites, coming into God's promised rest isn't so much the end of the journey, but it is the end of your wandering. Today, tomorrow, day after that. We're going to sing this song because this is the best way that the Sabbath manifests every single day. We trust him. So let's pray, and then we'll sing, then we'll be out of here. Okay. Father, forgive us when we so easily are overwhelmed by our inability to deal with life's circumstances, and when we don't turn to you. When fear and when worry and anxiety overwhelm these hearts that you have designed for rest, and yet we are so easily turned upside down. And Lord, many times we curse these decaying circumstances and say, God, why can't you be part of my life and keep me from things like this? Why can't you keep me from the giants? Why can't you make my life restful? And yet, Lord, you want us to understand that there is rest only in you, and that can be possible in the midst of decaying circumstances. Lord, that's a message so many people I bump up against need to hear. They need to understand there is a God who's near, who's present, who wants to be found. There is a God who wants to provide rest through his provision and his loving kindness, a God who has a purpose for us. We don't live purposeless lives. So, Lord, I pray that you'd continue to change in us, grow us more and more each day into Sabbath-like people, people who practice your presence, who depend on your provision, who are thrilled to tend to your purpose. And Lord, I pray that through what you do in our lives, those around us will look and say, what kind of God do you have anyway? It's a God whose faithfulness never finishes. His mercies seem to be created new every day, and his faithfulness is great. So thank you for this, and thank you for bringing us to a place of rest. There is indeed a Sabbath rest promise for the people of God. Thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.